Thomas Brennan had lived his entire life in the small town of Timber Ridge, Montana. At 62 years old, he was known throughout the community as the quiet man who kept to himself, tending to his modest property on the edge of town where the pine forests met the valley. His hands were weathered from decades of carpentry work, his back slightly bent from years of labor, but his eyes still held that spark of determination that had carried him through harder times. The winter of 2019 had been particularly brutal. Thomas lived alone in a small cabin he had built himself 30 years ago, right after his wife passed away. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a stone foundation. It had everything he needed and nothing he didn't. But there was one problem that had plagued him every winter since he built it: the astronomical cost of heating. His old fireplace consumed firewood like a hungry beast. Thomas would spend entire weekends chopping wood, stacking cords upon cords behind his cabin, only to watch them disappear within weeks. His Social Security check barely covered his property taxes and basic necessities. The firewood expense was crushing him, forcing him to choose between warmth and food more times than he cared to admit. One particularly cold February evening, as Thomas sat wrapped in 3 blankets watching his breath fog in his own living room, he made a decision. He had read about rocket mass heaters in an old Mother Earth news magazine he found at the town library. The concept fascinated him. A chimney design that used combustion principles to extract far more heat from far less wood. The scientific explanation went over his head, but the promise was clear: burn half the wood, get twice the heat. For 3 months, Thomas devoted every spare moment to studying the design. He sketched plans on old newspapers, calculated measurements, and saved every penny he could. By May, he had gathered enough materials, mostly salvaged from demolished buildings and his own scrap pile. His neighbors had no idea what he was planning. When construction began in early June, the spectacle drew immediate attention. Thomas started dismantling his old fireplace, removing the brick chimney that had stood for 3 decades. The Hendersons next door were the first to notice. Margaret Henderson, a woman whose opinions on everything from lawn care to politics were delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, stood at the property line with her husband Dale. "What on earth is he doing?" Margaret called out, not bothering to hide her nosiness. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Rebuilding my heating system." Dale Henderson squinted at the unusual configuration taking shape. "That chimney's going sideways first." "That ain't how chimneys work, Tom. Smoke goes up, not sideways. It's called a rocket mass heater," Thomas explained patiently. "It's more efficient." Margaret laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the yard. "More efficient? Thomas, you're 62 years old and you're trying to reinvent the wheel. Just leave the old chimney alone." Thomas didn't respond. He had learned long ago that some people couldn't see past their own assumptions. As the weeks progressed and the structure took shape, the mockery intensified. The unusual design featured a horizontal burn tunnel that fed into a heat riser, then exhausted through a long thermal mass bench before finally venting outside. To anyone unfamiliar with the concept, it looked absurd, backward, dangerous even. By July, the town's gossip mill was in full operation. At the local diner, Thomas overheard snippets of conversation about his project. At the hardware store, the clerk asked if he needed to call someone about the crazy old man building a death trap. Even Pastor Williams from the community church stopped by, expressing concern that Thomas might burn his house down. The worst came from his neighbor directly across the street, Robert Callahan. Robert was a wealthy contractor who had built a massive modern home with radiant floor heating and a fireplace that cost more than Thomas's entire cabin. Robert had always looked down on Thomas's modest lifestyle, and this project gave him new ammunition. One evening in late August, as Thomas was applying the final layer of cob mixture to seal the thermal bench, Robert stood on the sidewalk with 3 other neighbors, pointing and laughing. "Look at that thing," Robert announced loudly. "Looks like something a caveman would build. Tom, you know they invented central heating, right? This is America, not some third world country." The small crowd chuckled. Thomas felt the heat rising in his face, but he kept working, smoothing the earthen mixture with steady hands. "I give it 1 winter," Robert continued, One good freeze and that ridiculous contraption will crack apart. Then maybe the fire department can teach you about building codes. Thomas finally looked up. It'll work, Robert. You'll see. Robert smirked. Sure it will, buddy. Sure it will. Hey, when you freeze to death in December, can I buy your property? I've been wanting to expand my lot. The laughter that followed echoed in Thomas's ears long after the group dispersed. He stood there alone as the sun set behind the mountains, looking at his creation. It wasn't beautiful by conventional standards. The earthen bench looked primitive compared to the sleek designs in modern homes. But Thomas knew something they didn't. He had done the math, studied the science, and built it with precision. This wasn't about pride or proving anyone wrong. It was about survival. September arrived with the first hints of autumn chill. Thomas completed his rocket mass heater just as the aspen leaves began turning gold. He ran several test burns, adjusting the airflow and monitoring the draft. Everything functioned exactly as the plans predicted. The fire burned incredibly hot in the combustion chamber. The heat rose through the barrel, and the thermal mass absorbed warmth that radiated for hours after the fire died down. But the town's ridicule didn't die down. It intensified. At the post office, Thomas overheard two women discussing his project with barely concealed contempt. One of them was Linda Morrison, who worked at the county planning office. I checked the permits, Linda said to her companion. He didn't file anything for that monstrosity. Technically, I could report him, make him tear the whole thing down. Thomas pretended not to hear, but his hands trembled as he collected his mail. He had built on his own property, modified his own fireplace. He didn't think he needed permits for that. But now doubt crept in. What if they forced him to demolish it? He had spent his entire savings on materials. There was no money left to rebuild the old chimney or install conventional heating. By October, the situation had deteriorated further. Robert Callahan filed a formal complaint with the town council, claiming the structure was an eyesore that decreased neighboring property values. The council scheduled a hearing for mid-November. Thomas received the official notice on a gray Tuesday morning. His hands shook as he read the legal language threatening fines and forced removal if the structure was deemed unsafe or non-compliant. He would have to appear before the council, explain his design, possibly face engineering inspections he couldn't afford. That evening, he sat alone in his cabin, the weight of isolation pressing down on him. His daughter Emily lived in Seattle with her own family. They talked maybe twice a year. His few friends from his carpentry days had either moved away or passed on. The people of Timber Ridge had never fully accepted him, always seeing him as the odd widower who preferred solitude to socializing. The mockery had evolved into something darker. Teenagers started throwing eggs at his thermal bench, leaving sticky yellow stains on the earthen surface. Someone spray-painted the word stupid across his woodpile. Robert Callahan organized a neighborhood petition demanding the structure's removal, gathering 47 signatures. Thomas stopped going into town except when absolutely necessary. The stares, the whispered comments, the open laughter had worn him down. At night, he lay awake wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a stubborn old fool trying to prove something that didn't need proving. Winter was coming fast. The hearing was 3 weeks away. His firewood supply was half what it used to be because he had been so confident the new system would work. If the council sided with Robert, if they forced him to tear it down, Thomas didn't know what he would do. He had gambled everything on this backwards chimney design. And now it seemed the entire town was lined up to watch him fail. The first real snowfall came on November 8th, 2 weeks before the town council hearing. Thomas woke to find 6 inches of fresh powder blanketing Timber Ridge and the temperature hovering at 18 degrees. His breath formed clouds inside the cabin. It was time to truly test his creation. He loaded the combustion chamber with small sticks and kindling, using a fraction of the wood he would have needed for his old fireplace. He lit the fire and watched nervously as flames caught and spread. Within minutes, the burn was incredibly hot and clean, with almost no smoke. The heat rose through the barrel with a sound like a gentle roar, then flowed through the massive thermal bench. Thomas placed his hand on the bench surface. Warm. He waited 30 minutes. Warmer. After an hour, the entire bench radiated comfortable heat. The cabin temperature climbed from 52 degrees to 68. He used exactly 7 small pieces of wood. With his old fireplace, he would have burned through 20 logs by now and still been cold. Thomas sat on the thermal bench, feeling warmth seep into his aching bones. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in his chest. It worked. It actually worked. But working in private didn't matter if the town council forced him to tear it down in public. The next morning, Margaret Henderson knocked on his door, shivering despite her heavy coat. Her expression was different than usual, less judgmental, more curious. "Thomas, I hate to bother you, but our furnace died last night. Dale's waiting for the repairman, but that could be hours. I noticed smoke from your place. Is that crazy chimney thing actually running?" Thomas nodded. "Would you like to come in and warm up?" Margaret stepped inside and stopped immediately. Her eyes widened. "Thomas, it's like a sauna in here. How much wood have you burned?" "One small load this morning. The bench holds heat for 12 to 16 hours. She walked over and touched the thermal mass, then sat down tentatively. Within minutes, her shivering stopped. She stayed for over an hour, and Thomas explained the science behind the design, how the combustion chamber created such intense heat that it burned the smoke itself, extracting every BTU from minimal fuel. When Margaret finally left, she said something that surprised him. "I think I misjudged this, Thomas. I really did." If you're curious to see how this story turns out, and whether Thomas's design will survive the town council hearing, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. This is just the beginning of something remarkable. That afternoon, Margaret did something Thomas never expected. She called Linda Morrison at the planning office and told her to come see the system in operation. She called 3 other neighbors. By evening, 5 people had visited Thomas's cabin, felt the radiant heat, and seen the impossibly small amount of wood required. The whispers in town began to shift. Not everyone was convinced, but doubt had entered the narrative. Robert Callahan's certainty seemed less absolute, and Thomas, for the first time since summer, felt like maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to face the council alone. Word spread faster than Thomas anticipated. By mid-November, a steady stream of curious neighbors began appearing at his door. The brutal cold snap that settled over Montana made people desperate for heating solutions, and suddenly his backwards chimney didn't seem so ridiculous. Dale Henderson came by with a notebook, taking measurements and asking detailed questions. He was building a workshop and wanted to install a similar system. 2 families from across town drove out to see it after their heating bills doubled from the previous winter. But Robert Callahan wasn't backing down. He intensified his campaign, telling anyone who would listen that Thomas's visitors were being fooled by a dangerous fire hazard that would inevitably fail. He printed flyers warning about carbon monoxide poisoning and structural collapse, sliding them under doors throughout the neighborhood. The town council hearing arrived on November 22nd. Thomas entered the municipal building with his rolled-up plans, his calculations, and a knot of anxiety in his stomach. The council chambers were packed. Robert sat in the front row with a smug expression, flanked by supporters. But Thomas noticed something that gave him strength. Margaret Henderson sat on the opposite side with Dale, Linda Morrison, and a dozen other people who had visited his cabin. Robert presented first, his voice booming with confidence. "This amateur construction violates every principle of safe home heating. Thomas Brennan has no engineering degree, no professional certifications. He's built what amounts to a bomb in his living room based on some hippie magazine article. For the safety of our community and property values, this council must order immediate removal." Several council members nodded. Thomas felt his hope draining away. Then Margaret stood up. "May I speak?" The council president looked surprised but nodded. "I was Thomas's loudest critic," Margaret began. "I mocked him all summer. I thought he'd lost his mind. But 3 weeks ago, my furnace died and I went to his cabin to get warm. That system works better than anything I've ever seen. My husband and I spend $300 a month heating our house. Thomas spends maybe $40 in wood for the entire winter." Dale stood next. "I'm a retired mechanical engineer. I've examined his construction thoroughly. The design is sound, based on proven thermodynamic principles. Actually safer than conventional fireplaces because it burns so efficiently there's almost no creosote buildup. One by one, others stood. A young mother talked about visiting with her asthmatic son, noting the air quality was better than in homes with conventional wood stoves. An elderly veteran on a fixed income asked if Thomas would help him build one. Robert's face turned red. He shot to his feet. This is absurd. You're all being manipulated by a stubborn old man who got lucky. One accident, one house fire, and this council will be liable. The council president raised his hand for silence. Mr. Brennan, would you be willing to have your system professionally inspected by a certified engineer? Thomas's voice was steady. Yes, sir. Absolutely. The vote was 4-1 in favor of allowing the system to remain, pending a safety inspection. Robert stormed out of the chambers, slamming the door behind him. The certified engineer arrived 3 days after the hearing. His name was Dr. David Chun, a combustion specialist from the University of Montana who had designed heating systems for commercial buildings across the Northwest. Thomas watched nervously as Dr. Chun spent 4 hours examining every aspect of the rocket mass heater, taking temperature readings, testing airflow, and checking structural integrity. Finally, Dr. Chun stood up and smiled. Mr. Brennan, this is one of the most elegant heating solutions I've seen in 20 years of engineering work. Your combustion efficiency is remarkable. The thermal mass design is textbook perfect. Honestly, this should be taught in schools. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. So it's safe? Not just safe. It's superior to most conventional systems. I'm writing a report recommending the town council recognize this as innovative, sustainable technology. You've created something genuinely valuable here. The official report arrived at the council offices on December 3rd. It praised Thomas's design in technical language that left no room for doubt. The council sent Thomas a formal letter of approval and filed his system as a model for alternative heating solutions in the county records. But the real vindication came from the community itself. Robert Callahan's opposition collapsed overnight. His own heating bills that December exceeded $800 as temperatures plummeted to record lows. His massive modern house with its expensive radiant floors was bleeding him dry. Meanwhile, Thomas sat comfortably in his cabin, burning through a cord of wood that would last him 2 months. By Christmas, Thomas had received 43 requests from people wanting to learn how to build their own rocket mass heaters. He started holding weekend workshops in his cabin, teaching the principles of efficient combustion and thermal mass storage. Dale Henderson built one in his workshop and reported cutting his heating costs by 70%. Margaret convinced her church to install one in their fellowship hall. The local newspaper ran a feature story titled, "Timber Ridge Man's Backwards Thinking Leads Forward." The article included photos of Thomas standing beside his thermal bench, explaining the science to a group of fascinated learners. The reporter noted that his design could help low-income families and retirees afford heating during brutal Montana winters. Even more surprising was the apology that came in mid-January. Robert Callahan appeared at Thomas's door on a particularly cold evening, his expression humble for perhaps the first time in his life. "I was wrong," Robert said simply. "I let pride and prejudice blind me to something genuinely good. I'm sorry for the petition, the complaints, everything. I acted like a fool." Thomas invited him inside. They sat on the thermal bench together, and Thomas explained that the mockery had hurt, but he understood fear of the unknown often manifested as ridicule. "Would you teach me how to build one?" Robert asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "Come by Saturday. We're starting a new workshop group." For the first time in 30 years, Thomas felt like he truly belonged in Timber Ridge. His backwards chimney had done more than save him money. It had connected him to his community in ways he never imagined possible. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning in 2022, Thomas stood in front of the newly opened Timber Ridge Sustainable Heating Center. The building had once been an abandoned grain warehouse. Now it served as a workshop, classroom, and demonstration space for alternative heating systems. A large wooden sign above the entrance read, "Brennan Community Education Center." Thomas, now 65, had never imagined his life would take this turn. What started as one old man's desperate attempt to survive winter had transformed into a movement that spread across rural Montana and into neighboring states. Over 200 families had built rocket mass heaters based on his designs. Heating costs in Timber Ridge had dropped by an average of 55% for those who adopted the technology. The center offered free workshops every weekend. Dale Henderson taught the engineering principles. Margaret Henderson managed the volunteer schedule and community outreach. Even Robert Callahan, who had become one of Thomas's closest friends, led sessions on construction techniques and building code compliance. Thomas's daughter Emily had reconnected with him after seeing the newspaper articles online. She visited twice a year now, bringing his grandchildren to learn about Grandpa's famous chimney. The kids loved sitting on the warm thermal bench, listening to stories about the winter when everything changed. The state of Montana awarded Thomas a Governor's Innovation Grant, providing $50,000 to expand educational programs. A documentary crew from a Sustainable Living Network filmed a segment at his original cabin, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for DIY heating enthusiasts from across the country. But the moment that meant the most to Thomas came on a snowy December evening when a young single mother named Patricia brought her 2 children to his workshop. She was living in a trailer with broken heating, working 2 jobs and barely surviving. Thomas and his team spent 3 weekends helping her build a rocket mass heater in her small space. When they finished, Patricia cried as warmth filled her home for the first time in months. "That's why we do this," Thomas told his volunteers afterward. "It was never about proving anyone wrong. It's about helping people live with dignity." As Thomas locked up the center that October evening, he paused to look at the mountains silhouetted against the sunset. He thought about the man he had been 3 years ago, isolated, mocked, almost broken by ridicule. He thought about the backwards chimney that everyone said would never work. Sometimes the best solutions look wrong to people who've never questioned the conventional way. Sometimes survival requires the courage to build something different, even when the whole world laughs. And sometimes that backwards thing you create becomes the path forward for everyone else. Thomas smiled and headed home, where his thermal bench would be radiating gentle warmth long into the night, built from salvaged materials and stubborn hope, still burning half the firewood and twice as bright.